Your sleep is just as important as theirs. And I want to say this to you directly because I think moms mostly, but dads and grandparents will often dismiss the importance. And remember what I said in the beginning, everything that I share about why we sleep and the importance of it impacts all of us at any age. But mom, mostly, dad and grandma, your sleep matters. Full stop. A sleep-deprived parent is physiologically more reactive, less patient, and less emotionally available. That's just the nature of the beast. That's how we're wired. That is not a character flaw either. That is what sleep deprivation does to us human beings and to our brain. Right? And I think it's important that we give ourselves that grace, that is just how we work, and respect that and honor that. Everything I'm going to share today, the steps, the routines, the connection before sleep, requires a version of you that is rested enough to show up. You cannot pour from an empty cup. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. Protecting your sleep is not selfish. It's part of the plan. It's part of your lifestyle. Before I show you the science, I want to tell you where I was standing when I first began to understand this. Early in my career, I worked with adults recovering from traumatic brain injury. I think I've shared before that I didn't really care about kids too much, so I worked on an adult TBI, traumatic brain injury unit in acute hospitals. But I watched something there that really struck me and really made me look at my whole field in a different light, right? When we look at the adult who has a damaged brain, and when we give them the right conditions, right? Therapy and a good night's rest and good input and stimulation, we can actually rebuild their whole neural network. We can rewire and build new pathways either around the injury or let the injured section actually heal. And that was early in my career back in Southern California in the early 1990s. Neuroplasticity was just beginning to be understood and accepted. There was actually a lot of pushback, probably for the next 10, 15 years, that the science community was beginning to catch up with what we as clinicians had been observing in our work, right? That the brain is not fixed. Even when there's a traumatic brain injury, we can recover, at least partially. So you have to look at the brain as not as a machine that can break and stay broken. It's actually a living system with, to me, a breathtaking capacity to grow and adapt and heal and build throughout our entire lifespan. But in my early career, I remember thinking, if we can heal an injured brain on an older person, what could we do if we actually shaped the young developing brain with more intention? So I started to put those two things together, that with a healthy mindset, when we go into parenting or early child development and to study, what does it take to nourish that young developing brain? And that question changed everything about my work, my career, and my practice. I shifted from adults to young children because honestly, it gave me a lot more hope. And I thought, I want to get ahead of it. I want to prevent more than rehabilitate. And that's why now, after 40 years, I still genuinely get excited talking about what happens inside your toddler's brain while they're sleeping. Because here is something I have learned to count on. Science is about 18 to 20 years, science meaning research, it's about 18 to 20 years behind what we observe clinically in our practice, or even what the average person sees anecdotally in everyday life. If a person changes their lifestyle or tweaks their daily habit, how can we modify and enhance our brain, our body, our whole system, right? But I was there when neuroplasticity was on the fringe, and now I watched it move to being pretty foundational, right? I've watched this happen more than once. And this brings me to the discovery that I believe belongs in this same category, that every parent of a young child deserves to understand. I need you to stay with me for a while I share a little science here, because it's at the core of everything. And it's new and emerging as well. So back in 2012, a neuroscientist named Dr. Macon Nedegard, 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 at the University of Rochester, made a remarkable discovery. She actually identified what she called the glymphatic system. That's with a G, Glymphatic, glymphatic. And that's the brain's own dedicated waste clearing process. And it only activates while we sleep. So here's what happens. While we sleep, the spaces between the brain cells actually expand, and cerebrospinal fluid flows through, flushing out the toxic proteins that accumulate during the day while we live our lives, thinking, learning, working, all of it. The proteins she identified are mostly associated with Alzheimer's. So the brain is literally running several cleaning cycles every single night during our sleep. Dr. Nedegard's analogy was looking at it as a dishwasher. And I think that's spot on, because the brain cycles through these phases. And you can think of the dishwasher. There's a pre-rinse, a wash, a rinse, a dry. They have to go through these phases, and it needs to complete the full cycle to do its job. So her work was initially studied with adults, but now researchers are beginning to examine the glymphatic system in children. And what's emerging, I think, is beginning to raise significant questions. Because if disrupted sleep in the adult brain accelerates toxic buildup, which then result in cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's, what does chronic sleep disruption do to a brain that is not yet fully on board, that it's not just maintaining like an adult brain, but it's actually in the process of building itself? This is the connection I began drawing several years ago. And I'm always looking at the young developing brain with similar lens of what happens when there's an injury, right? Whether it was in my former days with adult traumatic brain injury, or now when we're looking at the rise in dementia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. What compromises a mature brain seems to cause the new, developing, young, immature brain to become more vulnerable. So I just want you to think about those pieces, and this is where I'm coming from. The glymphatic system in your toddler is not just cleaning house each night. It's actually clearing the construction site so the next day's building work can begin. Because go back to what I said in the beginning, they're under construction. We're literally building those neural pathways, those freeways and highways, and paving them over through his daytime work and his nighttime construction. Neuro freeways are being paved. Language pathways are being laid. Emotional regulation circuits are being wired. And you can look at it as both the right hemisphere, where that emotional, environmental understanding, nonverbal elements, and the left hemisphere, where speech and speech sounds, language concepts, processing speed, both hemispheres are being coded and wired. We cannot afford to interrupt that process chronically. And we do have to understand what the stages of sleep are. We know that the first 6 months is different than the second 6 months, and so on and so forth. But the research in children is still emerging, and we're really just now tapping into understanding what the pros and cons are. But I think the clinical pattern has been visible for a long time. We just have to be willing to pay attention. And I've never really felt comfortable in accepting sleep issues with a toddler or a preschooler, because I know what it's doing to the brain underneath, and I know what it compromises on the next day. So what is actually happening during those overnight hours? Well, let me kind of just lay it down. The brain cycles through 2 distinct stages of sleep. And maybe you've heard some of this. I'm just going to outline it for us so we can understand what's happening in your baby's brain, and how can we nurture that and nourish that and honor that, right? So there are 2 stages of sleep. There's the non-REM sleep, which is non-rapid eye movement sleep. And then there's the REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. And those are 2 phases. These repeat multiple times every night. Each pass is doing specific, irreplaceable work, and there's a purpose. So the non-REM sleep is the physical restoration stage. And this is where your body repairs tissue. It builds the immune system and strengthens it. It inspires or triggers growth hormone release. And this is literally where your toddler is growing overnight, right? And that's an important phase that we have to honor and respect. And it's when the lymphatic system is most active. It's running its deepest cleaning cycles during the non-REM sleep stage. Now, REM sleep is the cognitive engine. And as a speech language pathologist, this is the stage that never stops fascinating me. This is where emotional processing happens, where new words that your child heard that day actually get consolidated and pulled into long-term memory. It's where experiences get sorted and filed and integrated into the brain's growing architecture. And whatever milestone they're working through, whether it's rolling over or crawling or those first words or putting words together or following directions, all of those are being consolidated during the sleep hours. And you can think about it as where during the day, those neural pathways are being built, but at night, that's where the neural freeways are actually getting paved. There's also a lot of pruning going on. So they're throwing out literal garbage at nighttime, old protein cells, but also elements that they don't need as they move forward. But think about this whole stage as brain growth, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and language acquisition. Every one of these milestones is built inside those sleep cycles. So please, I know it's hard to wrap our minds around this, but it's not rest. is literally continued construction from the day's work.